Thank you, Bruno, and thank you also to Michigan State and the ESPP for the invitation to attend today. I'm really quite honored to be here. I am an alum of Michigan State, and it's a huge honor to be asked to come back and talk here. So I wanted to offer a science communication practitioner's perspective about tipping points and science communication and what we're doing and what we're not doing and what we might want to do. And I'm starting off here with this painting by Jean Perrault called Au Café because this actually came from a blog called Women Listening to Men in Art History. And I thought it was just a brilliant depiction of what often happens with science communication and what we're trying to avoid. But because there are students attending today, I think, I wanted to give you a little bit of a history about how I came to do what I'm doing right now, because it's not perhaps the career trajectory that you might have anticipated. So I started here at Michigan State. I got a bachelor's degree in zoology, now becoming integrative biology, but it was zoology when I was here. And then went on to graduate school at the University of Rhode Island's Graduate School of Oceanography, or what we all call GSO. While I was at GSO, my research focused on species diversity and ecology of nanoplankton in a small estuary in Rhode Island. Nanoplankton are a very small size fraction of plankton, and I was looking at how they change over a salinity gradient in that estuary and over time, over seasonal scales. So I have these amazing photos that I took while I was there. These are about 2 million photos that I took. I spent a lot of time in dark rooms by myself trying to figure out what I was looking at and why it mattered. And I determined that this was not the highest, best use of my life. I loved what I was doing, but it was not having the kind of impact that I wanted to have in the world. So I was looking for other opportunities. And that brought me to a fellowship called the John Knaus Marine Policy Fellowship that is organized by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA's Sea Grant program. So John Knaus, who's the gentleman on the right there, this is his photo from when he was the administrator of NOAA, was actually a real science communication innovator. He was a physical oceanographer, and this man has solid chops as a scientist. He was really quite impressive and important for the field. But he became interested in science communication as a member of the Stratton Commission, which was a commission formed in the 60s by the president to better understand what was going on with marine resources for the US and to figure out how to manage them better. So as a member of this maybe 12-person or so commission, John was one of the people responsible ultimately for the development of the National Environmental Policy Act, the development of NOAA, the development of the Environmental Protection Agency, and a much longer list of very important agencies and laws that exist today. Not that he did this single-handedly, but the Stratton Commission really was a part of this. So NOAA Sea Grant, and in fact, John, when he was NOAA administrator, founded Sea Grant. They developed this program, the Knaus Marine Policy Fellowship, to bring marine scientists into the world of federal policy to help inform policy in just the way that John Knaus did when he was a younger scientist. So I was very fortunate to be one of these fellows, and my placement was at the House of Representatives. I worked for a congressman from New Jersey, Frank Pallone, and I was responsible for his environment portfolio and for a time for his energy portfolio. I knew precisely nothing about energy, but I had to learn real fast because the Northeast blackout, which affected his district, happened while I was on board. So this program was a great way for me to learn not only about environmental policy and how scientists can help to inform the development of good policy, but it was a great lesson in science communication. And this was an early indication that I was really interested in this. So I came back to Rhode Island to finish my PhD because I hadn't actually done that when I did the fellowship, and ended up getting a job completely as a surprise to myself as the executive director of Metcalf Institute for Marine and Environmental Reporting. And Metcalf's mission is to expand accurate news coverage of the environment. Ultimately, we hope that great and more frequent news coverage will improve public understanding, deepen public understanding of the science underlying environmental issues. And we do this through training for journalists, professional journalists, as well as science training for journalists and communication training for scientists. And a few years ago, we updated our mission statement a little bit to add "and other science communicators," because increasingly we recognize that it's not just journalists and scientists who need help figuring out how to talk about science. There are a lot of other people who are doing science communication, and we wanted to give ourselves the opportunity to fold them in to our work. So, needless to say, I believe science communication is important as the executive director of Metcalf Institute, and I want to help you be convinced that that's the case too. National Geographic did me a solid by making this the cover of this month's magazine. This is the quintessential answer to why science communication is important. There is a very anti-science sentiment among a lot of people in the US, at least. I'm talking about the US throughout the majority of my talk here. And as they show here, it's about climate change and evolution and vaccines and whether the moon landing actually happened or not. There are a lot of different examples. And, and the Senate responds as though they know a lot about science, even though they're not scientists. So there are all of these anti-science behaviors in pop culture. There's the politicization of science. And meanwhile, we have all of these globally significant, critical environmental issues that are not going away and require some very thorny policy decisions. And it's critical that a lot more people become engaged and interested in issues of science and science policy to have any traction on these global issues. So to do this, we need to make audiences feel like they're a part of the scientific endeavor and not separate from it. However, this is the world I grew up in. And in case you can't read this, the line at the bottom of this James Stevenson cartoon says, "One thing I'll say for us, Meyer, we never stooped to popularizing science." And that is very much the academic world that I grew up in, so to speak. And this is not just the stuff of cartoons. This was the reality for one of the most famous science communicators in the world, Jane Goodall, who recently she was interviewed in this great story in the New York Times Magazine written by Paul Tullis. And there was an anecdote in there about when her first book, My Friends, the Wild Chimpanzees, came out in the mid-'60s. And so this is the quote from his story. "When her book appeared, before her PhD was even completed, her Cambridge mentor sputtered with rage." And this is the quote. It's for the general public." And you could just see the disdain dripping from this man's face as you read these words. And then to finish the quote from Paul Tullis's story, "She told me she was nearly expelled from the program for daring to write a book that might appeal to an audience beyond academia." This is how scientists were treated who tried to do this sort of thing in the 1960s. Thankfully, we have come quite a long way since then, and now there are many more scientists, some of whom you have heard of and know of very well, and others maybe you haven't. So I've tried to indicate just a very, very small selection of some of them here. On the top right, James Hansen. I'm sure many of you in this room, if not all of you, have heard of James Hansen before, climate scientist at NASA who has spent decades now studying climate and also really advocating for action to stop climate change. So he falls into the scientist as researcher and activist category, without a doubt. To the left, there's a tweet from Katherine Hayhoe, who's an atmospheric scientist at Texas Tech University and an evangelical Christian. So she has brought just a fascinating and so important voice to conversations about climate change, because she is saying not only, I am an expert in this topic, and here's what I know scientifically from my research and those of my colleagues, but also, I am an evangelical Christian, and I feel an obligation as such, according to the rules of my faith, to respond to this. And that has really changed the conversation in a lot of ways. And she's also a very active tweeter, which is fantastic. So below her tweet is Daniel Pauly, a fisheries scientist who became well known for his work on on overfishing and talking about how we have shifted baselines in the world ocean by fishing down the food web, fishing out those major fish species, the predators at the top of the food web, and then going down. And he has spoken about this in a wide variety of audiences because he feels compelled to do so. And then to his right is Nancy Rabelais, who's a friend of mine and someone that I have great respect for. She is an ecologist that works at the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium, or LUMCON, and she studies how nutrient inputs from farming into the Mississippi River come down the Mississippi, empty out into the Gulf of Mexico, spur huge development and blooms of algae. The algae die. As they die, bacteria eat them, consume the oxygen, and leave this massive dead zone there. And this has huge implications for the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem. So she is pretty single-handedly the person that brought this to the public's attention, and now many, many other people study this too. She also, after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, was very outspoken about her concerns about the impacts of that oil spill on ecosystems in the Gulf of Mexico and the shoreline. So there are these scientists now who feel compelled to talk to the public about their research and about its implications. But most scientists don't know how to do this, are afraid to try, and are therefore stuck in this kind of in-between place where they want to do something, they don't know how to do it. So there are more and more opportunities for training offered by Metcalf Institute and many other fantastic organizations around the country. But there's not enough, and it's not part of graduate education yet, graduate science education, natural science education, to get prepared to talk about science. Another very important aspect of science communication, of course, is journalism. And I didn't want to talk about this a lot, even though it's what I do all the time, because Andy Revkin's going to be here later and he'll have a lot to say. But I did want to make a point that after the huge losses of specialized beat reporters in environment and science in the mid to late 2000s, there has been a big burst in nonprofit news coverage of the environment. There are a lot of organizations that are trying to fill the holes, and there are holes, and there's a huge need for this. So I offer just a few of the many, many nonprofit news outlets that are trying to do this, and I wanted to draw your attention to one of them, Beacon, here on the left. This is a group called Climate Confidential, a group of reporters that organized themselves and used Beacon, which is this crowdsourcing project for journalism, as their vehicle to get their reporting done. And this is what it's come to, people. You have to crowdsource journalism to get it done sometimes, and that's a little bit heartbreaking. But if it works, hey, that's fantastic. So there's a great deal of interest in environmental news coverage. That need is not necessarily being met yet. There's a lot of space for more of it. But of course, it's not just scientists. Mass media are also doing a lot of talking about science and the environment. There was the relaunch of Cosmos last year with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and there's IFLS, which is a fantastic source for kind of irreverent looks at science and the environment, and even Mythbusters. And if you wonder why I have Mythbusters up here, I have one thing to say: XKCD. XKCD is a great cartoon strip written by a cartoonist named Randall Munroe, and this one nicely sums up what's going on. So to save you some time, let me just orient you here. So there's these two people saying Mythbusters is entertaining, but it's not science. And then zombie Richard Feynman comes along and wants to eat brains, but he also says, hey, listen, back off. Mythbusters is actually pretty great. And they say, but they fail at basic rigor. And then his point, which I've highlighted and read here, is ideas are tested by experiment. This is the core of science. Everything else is bookkeeping. By teaching people to hold their beliefs up to experiment, Mythbusters is doing more to drag humanity out of the unscientific darkness than 1,000 lessons in rigor. Show them some love. So the point here, of course, is that people need to understand scientific process and critical thinking more than they actually need to know the specific facts about a topic. Because once you are equipped with those critical thinking skills, you can apply them to anything. I know I have a PhD and I do this all the time. So when scientists think about science communication, these are some of the reasons they might come up with to do this. The number one is going to, for most scientists, is going to be public understanding. These people don't understand anything about what I do, and I have got to fix that. I have got to make sure they get it because what I do is important, says every one of the 5 gazillion scientists on the earth. After that, they might want to talk about science to broader audiences because of how they, as scientists, or we collectively as scientists, are perceived, or maybe because they're trying to do something about the, abysmal funding opportunities for science, and so they're trying to get people excited and jazzed so there will be more money, or to affect research priorities, partnerships, policy decisions. But then you notice that at the bottom here I have obligation and public engagement in question mark, or in parentheses with question marks, because those things are not necessarily the reasons that a scientist wants to communicate. They might be, yes, sure, I have received federal tax dollars to support my research, so maybe I have a sense of obligation to talk about it with broader audiences, and maybe I want to engage the public, but among natural scientists especially, there is generally a real reticence to truly engage people, meaning not talk at them, but converse with them. So this is something that is very much in flux right now among scientists. Whereas for a non-scientist, the things that might inspire you to be interested in science communication are very personal. Am I affected by this? And am I affected by it economically? Is this taking money out of my pocket or putting it into my pocket? Are there policy decisions going to be made that will affect me and or the health of my children? I paid for that study, and therefore I have an obligation, or rather I have a right to know what's going on here and what the results are. Or science is cool. And of course, science is cool is always going to be there. Thankfully, this is an evergreen interest. And I just put this nice data visualization by John Nelson here from NASA data because science is cool. And there are so many ways that we can attract diverse audiences to wanting to learn more about science because, in fact, science is cool. So what is a science communicator? This is very much an important point from my perspective because often people think science communicators are scientists or journalists, and that is a very small portion of, in fact, all of the science communicators that are out there. There's nonfiction authors and bloggers and formal educators, people that create museum displays, public relations professionals, artists. These are all different people with different agendas, different motivations to talk about science, communicate science. And this example is a sculpture by Natalie Miebach, who's based in Boston. And I was lucky enough to meet her recently, and she spoke in one of our programs. Natalie converts her own data, as well as in this particular piece, her data that she collected, weather data, as well as historical and buoy data, all at the same time to create a basket. So basket weaving is her medium. And she is telling a story here, a 3-dimensional, tactile story, because as she said in her talk, not all of us are visual learners. She looks at slides like mine and she just glazes over. Whereas as a kid, she wanted to play with Legos because she wanted to build things to understand how the world works. And so that's what she does now professionally. She builds things that are stunning in their detail. And let me give you a close-up. This next slide is from her, and it shows her what she's doing. So just to back up, we're looking at the middle section, the kind of girdle of that basket. And so what you can see is that some of the pieces there represent phases of the moon, some represent air temperature, some represent water temperature or the tidal cycle. She is telling a story with this basket about a warm winter. She is physically demonstrating changes in weather for you. And science communicators need to think this way. We need to think differently and much more creatively about how we tell stories of science. There are as many reasons for people to want to communicate science as there are ways to do it and people who are doing it. Alas, with all of these reasons and ways, we're not doing it terribly well. And there are a number of reasons for that. Scientists aren't trained to communicate, as I said before. Scientists in academic systems are not rewarded for this according to the promotion and tenure system. They might face doubtful or disdainful colleagues, and in the case of some climate scientists, they might actually even receive death threats for talking about their science to general audiences. A second problem is that a lot of quote-unquote communicators aren't trained in science, and so feel a little not confident in how they talk about science. There's a bias against the kind of science communication that Natalie Miebach is doing, where some people think that this is not rigorous and therefore not valuable. And then, like I said before, there's this growth in opportunities for science communication training, but there's pretty minimal research on effectiveness of this training. One of the things that we do know, though, is that throwing more facts at people is not the answer. And this illustration by Maki Naro is a really nice depiction of this. So what social scientists have called the deficit model is basically there is a deficit of information among, quote unquote, the public. And I say it like that because that assumes that there is one public, and that's of course not true. So people don't have enough information, and if we just give them more information, then they'll understand. But it turns out that doesn't work because every single person is bringing their own values, motivations, interests, experiences to any interaction that they have. And therefore, you have to really engage with people. You have to come to where this person is to truly communicate with them in any way that will resonate with them. So engagement requires understanding your audience, and even if you don't truly know that audience, you have to make an effort to get to know them and communicate with them in ways that appeal to them and resonate with them. So we do, because of the research that's been going on this, the social science research, and I am not a social scientist, so please keep that in mind as I'm saying these things. There are some emerging best practices, like the deficit model doesn't work, we need to engage, we need to include all these perspectives. There's great work being done here by Tom Dietz and Bruno Takahashi and others about what is driving these effective methods for science communication and what's not. So there are all of these different ways that we can think about best practices in science communication, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions. And so I wanted to just give you a couple quick insights on this. This is only the tip of the iceberg, but it's just to give you a sense of some of the questions that are being asked. So on this slide, start by looking at the figure on the right. I want you to see that the gray bars represent people going to, this is from the National Science and Engineering Indicators report that comes out every year. This is from last year's report. So the gray bars represent people going to the internet to get information. And you'll see that on that bottom line there, 60% of people who want information about specific scientific issues go to the internet to find it. And of course we can all relate to this because that's probably what most of us do. It also turns out that 90% of internet users actually find information using search engines. That's how they start. Now the good news there is that there's research showing that time spent on the internet is linked to more positive attitudes about science. So that's great. However, it turns out that search engine algorithms and prior searches that you have made yourself actually drive the responses that you get in the future. So there is, as the authors of this particular paper said, a self-reinforcing information spiral that happens between your queries to a search engine and the responses that you get. So lo and behold, it turns out that by going to the internet, the World Wide Web for information, we might actually be narrowing the information that we get. And so what does that mean to science communication and the effectiveness of science communication? Well, this is an open question. Also, what is social media doing in the context of this? It turns out that, obviously, and you all know this, if you go to see a news site online now, often there will be a Twitter feed or a Facebook feed or something next to it showing Facebook likes for that story or Twitter comments on that story. So this is now adding meaning, whether it's true or not, to that story. So as a person comes to read a news story, and if they happen to see Twitter comments about that story on the right, then they might be getting completely skewed ideas of what that story means or its significance, or not. Maybe they're getting great perception or perspectives on that story, but you just don't know. And we, in general, don't know what kind of meaning is social media adding or subtracting from news stories. And then there are all of these other questions, and again, this is not even, this is an infinitesimal look at the kinds of questions that are still out there for science communication, but how does framing affect a story? Are we going to talk about the 20% fat in our yogurt or the 80% fat-free-ness of our yogurt? Framing is really important, and it affects interpretations. There's also, how social and natural scientists can work together more effectively. So shout out to ESPP here, because clearly this is exactly what you're doing. How does news coverage affect understanding and or engagement? And then social media. Is this expanding our understanding, or is it limiting it? And you're going to hear a lot more from other speakers today about many other areas that are in need of research to understand science communication effectiveness. And I hope that you'll keep this in mind as you go through those days, as you go through the day. And then, in my mind, a really big question in science communication effectiveness and application practice is about scientific uncertainty. Scientific uncertainty is a fundamental aspect of the scientific method. We don't ever know anything for sure. We can only kind of home in and reduce our uncertainty about something. And that's a critical and valuable aspect of the process of scientific research. But it is one that non-scientists generally don't understand at all or have an appreciation for. And I think that because uncertainty is such a huge part of figuring out these major environmental questions that we're facing today, we have got to figure out how to more effectively communicate this. And this is very much up for grabs at this point, so students in the room, please go to it. To conclude here, science communication is booming. We are in such a better state than we were even 10 years ago in terms of the efforts to communicate science to broad audiences and the ways that we're doing it. But we need a lot more research, and I put that little laugh line in there because this is how you can tell I'm a scientist. We need more research, people. We have to have it. It has to happen. But it's true. And especially the social science research is just so critical, and there are so many people doing great work on this, but we need a lot more of it. And then, of course, more engagement, not more facts. And we need to be creative to really culturally integrate science and help people see this, as I think I said before, not as apart from themselves, but really as part of their everyday lives. We need to cultivate this curiosity and the critical thinking that goes along with that to really start moving forward in some of these challenges we face. And so my final point is just that the fate of the Earth rests not only on the science, but on our ability to communicate that science and make people feel a part of it. I don't know who these characters are, but I thought this was just fantastic, and I had to put it up there. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take questions.